because, you know, so many people have asked me, how do I communicate this with my friends and family? And when I do, I don't sound like I know what I'm talking about, and aren't all the virologists, and then here's this study here. And so maybe this will help people out. And I appreciate that there may be some of this that's a little complicated, but I'm hoping I can make it understandable to everybody. So with that, the first issue is we're talking about what the cause of COVID-19 is. COVID-19 is the quote disease. It's why people are getting sick or what's happening to them. And of course, we all have been told that the cause of COVID-19 is this coronavirus. Now, the first thing I would point out is when you ask most people, why do you think that the coronavirus is the cause of COVID-19? They say things like, well, a lot of people died in Wuhan, and then a lot of people died in New York City. And then there was this outbreak on the cruise ship, and then there was the nursing home. And then Uncle Fred went to a party, and the next thing you know, everybody got sick. Or they wore masks, or they didn't wear masks in Brazil, and then things happened, and then the number of cases went down. And I would only point out that all of these and many more are what we would call in science epidemiological observations. And as any scientist or competent medical doctor would tell you, nobody thinks that you can use epidemiology to prove causation. In other words, you use epidemiology, all these observations and more, to generate hypotheses that then you can test to see what the cause is. So I now tell people, I don't need any more epidemiological observations. I've heard hundreds of them. I agree we should test for viral or microbiological causation. I don't need to be convinced about that. I would say, though, that there have been many examples in the past, like with scurvy, when a lot of sailors died on ships, one after another. For 100 years, they thought it was an infection, and then eventually somebody ate a lime, and the whole thing got better, and it turned out it was wrong. And one of my points of this is when people say it's not compassionate to not accept the dominant narrative, I actually think that's totally not right, because if we had accepted the dominant narrative with scurvy, nobody would have known that they should eat lemons, and a lot more people would have suffered needlessly and died. So it's not compassionate to not know the real answer. So that's the first thing. Now, the question then is, how do you know whether a virus is causing a disease? And here, again, it's a very interesting thing, because if you ask most people, okay, we agree that epidemiology only generates hypotheses. Do you know how we know? And 98% of the people have no idea how we would go about showing that a virus causes a disease, which I think is interesting, because if you don't even know how you would go about proving it, it's just curious that you would be so sure that it's the case. But there is a definite method of doing this. It's called isolation and purification. And then once you isolate and purify, you can then test it on animals and deliver the virus or the bacteria in a normal way and see if it causes sickness. One of the main points of our book is nobody has isolated or purified the virus, even though we have maybe 20 titles of peer-reviewed papers in the most prestigious journals of all saying isolation and purification of the virus. But when you actually read the paper, you find out that they did no such thing. Now, here's my point here. I don't actually expect anybody to believe me about that, because, you know, who am I to say, who am I to be believed? But let's, for instance, I'm now going to read you what the CDC said about isolation and purification. Because again, if you haven't isolated and purified it, you don't know what you're looking at. You actually haven't even proven that it exists. And then you cannot do any kind of PCR test on something that you haven't proven exists. It's like taking a hair and saying it must have come from a unicorn, and I don't actually have never seen a unicorn, and then you make up a picture of a unicorn on your computer, and then you do a test to see if you can find the hair, and the whole thing is crazy. So here's what the CDC says. Since no quantified virus isolates of the 2019 nCoV virus are currently available. That's science talk for saying we have no evidence of an isolated, purified virus. Therefore, we don't actually know it exists. Now, in a brilliant article by somebody that I now call my friend, Torsten Engelbreit, he actually asked the authors of the 6 most important papers on the isolation and purification of the virus, because it didn't look like they actually isolated or purified the virus. And so you could say, well, how do I know? And one of the reasons I know is because of what the authors of the paper said. So here's an article published in a peer-reviewed journal that talks about isolation and purification. And Torsten asked them, did you isolate and purify and then confirm that you're seeing a new virus? And they said, quote, no, we did not obtain an electron micrograph showing the degree of purification. That's the only way a scientist can see that. And then another one claiming they isolated and purified a virus said, quote, the image is the virus budding from an infected cell. It is not a purified virus, meaning they don't know if there is a virus. Here's another one. It's called, this is from a paper, Identification of Coronavirus Isolated from a Patient in Korea with Covid19. Question, did you isolate and purify the virus? Answer, quote, we could not estimate the degree of purification because we did not purify and concentrate the virus. And yet this was published in, a peer-reviewed public health journal and is considered the most important paper written to show the existence of this virus. And they said they didn't isolate and purify. Here's another one. This was in the Journal of Korean Medical Science called Virus Isolation from the First Patient with SARS-CoV-2 in Korea. Question, did you isolate, purify, and confirm the virus? Answer, we did not obtain an electron micrograph showing the degree of purification. In other words, no, we didn't isolate and purify. We have no idea what was in this that we were analyzing with our PCR tests. And I could go on because we actually analyzed and wrote in the book summaries and the methods that all these researchers, I would say, erroneously used to claim isolation and purification. Now, I wasn't necessarily going to try to just bore you with science here, but what is the point here? The point is, Sally and I hopefully did our due diligence. We talked to many other doctors. I have a whole group of some medical doctors and some PhD in various sciences. And we scoured the literature to find out properly done studies that show that isolated and purified viruses or bacteria cause disease. And the answer we came up with was these studies don't exist, period. Now, is it possible that we overlooked them and were wrong? Of course, and that's the whole issue with open societies and with scientific debate. I would actually love and welcome for a group of virologists to say, no, this is not how you isolate and purify. Fine, we can talk about that. I happen to know I'm right, that this is the accepted way. The reason I know that is because in 1973, the Pasteur Institute laid out the guidelines for the isolation and purification of the virus. Exactly what we're talking about. And they don't do that. But if they think differently, I would love for them to go line by line in the book and say, this is wrong, we isolated and purified this way, and this is valid. So far, nobody has come forward with that. Or I would like to say, no, we overlooked this study or that study, and we're wrong. Here's isolated, purified, whatever, and what causes disease. You didn't see this study. And I've actually asked at least 20 so-called scientists to give me a reference for that, and I haven't seen it. So the issue isn't whether we're 100% right on everything. Of course not. The issue is we made our best attempt to document the actual science of this. We came to a conclusion. We put it out there. We then said, if it isn't from a coronavirus, what is it? And then we said, here's epidemiological evidence, here's mechanistic evidence, here's a whole host of other evidence for why Sally and I think we should study things like poor diet, bad food, bad water, electromagnetic fields, glyphosate in the air, pollution, cyanide, fear, you name it. Why don't we study those? Why don't we take 1/10 of our budget for science and study things that actually make people sick? And that's the problem, because if we cut off the scientific debate, we can in no way claim we live in a free, fair, open, democratic society. We will live in a society of medical tyranny, and the people who just, they're essentially scientifically illiterate, so therefore they have to trust experts. And I think I'll speak for Sally, we don't want you to be illiterate. We want you to know the science, and if you have questions about it or studies that dispute it, please send them to us. We welcome that. So I realize I went on a high horse, but it's about time, I think.
Yeah, the other point, Tom, is that no one's done contagion studies either. We've thrown trillions of dollars at this problem we have. They haven't found a virus, and Tom was quoting from a document that's online, July 2020, saying we don't have this virus. We have not isolated this virus. Unless they've done something between July and today, there's no virus. But the other thing they could do is contagion studies. And we point out that during the flu of 1918, they did contagion studies. They had volunteers who were well, and they're actually quite amusing to read. The ones who were sick came and sat down, or they got together, the sick and the well, and the sick people got very close to the well people and breathed on them. And they also took blood from the sick people and injected it into the well people. So any way they could pass this disease on to well people, they tried. And not a single healthy person got sick from contact with a sick person. And of course, they were totally flummoxed. They didn't know what to say. They said, well, it's got to be contagious. But it wasn't, not by their studies. And so that terrible flu that killed 50 million people was not contagious. Now, what about today? Have they done something like this for coronavirus? They have done a study with hamsters. And the hamsters, they took, was it from people, Tom, or other animals? They took, what they said was this mixture of bodily fluids. And they had two groups of hamsters. One were genetically modified hamsters that had very reactive immune systems, and a couple of them got the sniffles. But the normal hamsters, not one got sick from this attempt to make them sick by exposure to what they said was the virus. So far, we don't have any studies. We have absolutely no proof that this illness can be passed from one person to another. And yet all of the things that are being done today, the masks and the social distancing and keeping kids out of school, all of this is predicated on the assumption, the theory, that one person can pass this sickness to another person through droplets in the air and through close contact. We have absolutely no proof of this, and there have been no studies to try to determine whether this disease is contagious.
Yeah, I can even flesh actually, Sally, I think it was mice, not hamsters.
Oh, mice, I thought it was hamsters.
Here's the shoddy science, and people have sent me, I know hundreds of people have sent me, because the title of the paper was Koch's Postulates, which are the recognized standard for proving causation, fulfilled for SARS-CoV-2 virus. So here's what they did. They took some mucus from somebody who was sick, they centrifuged it, they took the liquid out, they didn't purify it, so they had God knows what in there, and they injected this unpurified, so therefore you can't possibly know which part of this centrifuged mucus actually caused disease. And they injected that into normal mice, none got sick. And then they injected it into mice genetically modified to have fur problems, and approximately 20% got fur problems after the injection, which was not statistically significant, had nothing to do with COVID-19. None of them got any symptoms that were at all like COVID-19. This is a fraudulent study. And again, the point here is, okay, this is, I'm a medical doctor, even though I knew nothing about this when I graduated from medical school or training, nothing. So I had to teach myself how to be fluent in virology. And so I did, because I thought it would help my patients. And so the point now is, now that I am fluent in virology, I have a scientific analysis of this study that tells me this is nowhere near the truth. If there's some other scientist or virologist out there who says I'm wrong, again, I'd love to hear it and why. But instead, what I hear is, oh, you're not a virologist, you have no right to say this, this is impacting my family's life. All these things, it has nothing to do with whether that experimental method is actually valid to prove causation, because it isn't. And I just want to then say one thing about masks. Again, our point here was, let's talk science. And so, again, at the risk of boring people, there actually have been some very good studies done on the efficacy of masks in preventing poor outcomes in vulnerable people. Now, the vulnerable people that they used were mainly people on dialysis, people who are diabetics, and then most importantly, people with surgery. So over the last 30 years, there have been a number of studies looking at, very good studies, if the surgeons and the nurses wear masks, do the surgical patients have a better outcome, right? So if you say surgical patient, that's a vulnerable group. What happens if the surgeons wear masks or not? And so here's the answer. I'll just summarize here. The surgical site infections occurred in 11.5% of the mask group and in only 9% of the no mask group. In other words, if the surgeons and operating room team wore masks, the vulnerable patients, the surgical patients, got sick more, period. I have 11 other studies that came to the same conclusion, all in the peer-reviewed literature. We put some of them, I believe, in the book. Here's the conclusion. If you wear a mask, if a vulnerable, potentially, frail or elderly or nursing home person is exposed to people wearing masks, the science says they'll get sick more. Period. Now, why? I don't really know. Maybe it's just the fear or the horror of seeing people in masks. Maybe it's social isolation. Maybe wearing a mask breeds toxic organisms that make poisons that affect you. Maybe it's who knows what. But the point here is the science is very clear. Wearing a mask makes the more vulnerable people around you more likely to get sick. So this business of you not wearing a mask or me not wearing a mask, that's inconsiderate, or it's not being cognizant of the feelings and needs of others. The actual science is, I don't want people to get sick. And since I know from the science that if everybody wears a mask, everybody around them gets sicker, why would I want to do that? There's nothing compassionate in that. So again, the point is, this was an attempt to lay out the facts, lay out the science, lay out our reasons why we think this, point out that a lot of things need more study, and hope we get scientific feedback. And instead what we get is, you have no right to say this. I don't agree with that. That's all I can say. I don't agree with that.